The studio lights burned brightly as Jasmine Crockett adjusted her navy blazer and glanced over her notes one last time. At 33, the Texas Congresswoman had faced difficult audiences before, but tonight carried a different weight. Across from her sat Alan Dersowitz, projecting the confidence of a man who had spent decades dominating courtrooms and televised debates. At 85, the Harvard law professor emeritus carried himself with the entitlement of someone convinced that age and credentials ensured victory. "Representative Crockett thinks she can lecture me on constitutional law," Dersowitz had scoffed to producers during rehearsal, his tone thick with condescension. "I was teaching this subject when she was still in grade school. This will be amusing." But what followed would soon erase his smug expression. The moderator's voice cut through the tension. "Tonight we bring you Harvard law professor Alan Dersowitz facing Texas Representative Jasmine Crockett on the constitutional impact of recent judicial rulings. Professor Dersowitz, you've been outspoken about Representative Crockett's legal background." Leaning forward, adjusting his glasses with practiced flair, Dersowitz replied, "I have deep concerns about elected officials making constitutional claims without proper grounding. Too often, political rhetoric is confused with real legal scholarship." His eyes locked on Crockett, expecting her to falter under his reputation. The audience shifted uneasily, sensing the sharpness of his words. Crockett's jaw tightened slightly, but her calm expression didn't waver. She had prepared for this moment more than anyone realized. Before we dive deeper into this exchange, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss these high-stakes political debates. What comes next is something you'll want to see. The camera cut between the two. Dersowitz with his courtroom smugness, Crockett with the quiet determination of someone long underestimated. Neither anticipated that the next 20 minutes would reshape how millions viewed their arguments, their credentials, and their character. To grasp the weight of the clash, you need to know who these two were beyond the headlines. Dersowitz embodied the old guard of American legal academia, over 50 years teaching at Harvard Law, author of countless books, and defender of figures ranging from O.J. Simpson to Jeffrey Epstein. His resume read like a hall of fame in legal circles, and he wielded it like armor. At 85, he was used to deference, particularly from younger politicians he dismissed as amateurs intruding on his field. But his later years had been marked by controversy. His ties to high-profile clients with troubling reputations tarnished the image he once enjoyed among legal scholars. Critics argued that his best work was behind him, that his arguments were driven more by ego than by principle. Still, he remained a commanding presence on television, using his credentials to overpower less seasoned opponents. Tonight, he was determined to make an example of Jasmine Crockett. Crockett, however, represented everything Dersowitz scorned about modern politics. A young black woman from Texas, she had worked her way through law school while raising children, built a respected civil rights practice, and earned her congressional seat by mobilizing communities long ignored by traditional politicians. Her legal education wasn't Ivy League, University of Houston, not Harvard. Her courtroom battles weren't on the national stage, but in Texas courts on behalf of ordinary people. Yet, her career showed a commitment to service rather than prestige. What Dersowitz didn't realize, what almost no one realized, was that Crockett had been quietly preparing for this encounter for 6 months. She had studied not just constitutional law, but Dersowitz's own work, his courtroom methods, his media appearances spanning decades. Her preparation was systematic. Weekends were spent in her home office surrounded by law books, journals, and transcripts of his past debates. She built detailed files tracking his arguments, rhetorical habits, and most importantly, his contradictions. Her team sometimes teased her. "Congresswoman, you're putting more hours into this guy than most law students spend on finals," her chief of staff joked. But Crockett understood what they didn't. She knew moments like this could define careers. Too often, Rising politicians had been crushed on national television by seasoned figures who leaned on credentials as weapons. She refused to be another casualty. Her research revealed key patterns in Dersowitz's style. He leaned heavily on appeals to authority, mostly his own. He cited Harvard, his books, his famous cases, as if credentials alone secured victory. But he frequently avoided engaging the actual substance of opposing views, preferring instead to dismiss them as inexperienced. Worse, Crockett had discovered numerous contradictions in his record. He had shifted positions on executive privilege depending on who held the presidency, and his stance on congressional oversight seemed to change with the party in power. His interpretations often bent to political convenience. She now understood his weaknesses better than he did. The stakes were bigger than one debate. It was a test of whether experience could defeat preparation, whether prestige could silence authenticity, whether the old network still had the power to intimidate new voices. For Dersowitz, this was meant to be an easy win, a reminder of his authority. For Crockett, it was a chance to prove that the future did not have to bow to the past. The moderator pressed on. Professor Dersowitz, you've suggested Representative Crockett lacks the expertise to weigh in on constitutional law. Would you elaborate? Dersowitz smiled like a cat with its prey. I believe the public deserves officials who truly understand the law they help shape. Constitutional law isn't something you pick up from political talking points. The insult was veiled in academic formality, but its intent was obvious. The audience sensed it. Crockett sensed it. She was ready. He pressed forward, building his case like a prosecutor. Representative Crockett recently made bold claims about executive privilege, he said, flipping through a folder of notes. Claims that reveal a basic misunderstanding of Supreme Court precedent from 1974. He referred to her testimony, questioning presidential immunity, territory he thought was his home field. The ruling in United States versus Nixon is clear, Dersowitz declared, turning toward the camera as though Crockett's presence was secondary. Executive privilege is limited, but it has defined boundaries that any first-year law student should know. His words dripped with condescension. He was now performing, flaunting knowledge while implying Crockett had none. And further, he continued, gaining momentum, her statements on judicial review suggest she has yet to grasp the fundamental principle of separation of powers. These aren't partisan matters. They are the foundation of our legal system. Crockett stayed, silent, allowing him to dig deeper. She knew something he had forgotten. The more one digs, the harder it becomes to climb out. Professor Dersowitz, the moderator cut in, Representative Crockett deserves a response. Of course, Dersowitz said, feigning generosity, as though granting a student the chance to fumble through an answer. I'm curious to hear her take on these basic constitutional ideas. But Crockett didn't respond defensively. She smiled. Professor, I appreciate the constitutional refresher, she began evenly, though I must say for someone so intent on accuracy, you seem to have overlooked a few details yourself. Dersowitz raised an eyebrow. This wasn't the reaction he expected. I'm sorry, he said sharply. When you cite United States v. Nixon, you're right that it placed limits on executive privilege, Crockett replied, checking her notes. But you left out the nuance. The court didn't just say privilege isn't absolute. It laid out a four-part test for when privilege can be overridden. She looked him directly in the eye, no longer the intimidated opponent he had expected. More importantly, you referenced judicial review as if it were a settled, unchanging doctrine. Crockett continued, her voice steady. But you're ignoring how it has evolved, particularly in cases involving congressional oversight, which, as a member of Congress, I deal with firsthand. Dersowitz shifted in his chair. This wasn't following the script he had envisioned. Representative, I think you're oversimplifying a complex doctrine, he tried to reassert. Am I? Crockett's tone remained calm, though the firmness underneath was unmistakable. Because I'm looking at your 2019 Law Review article where you argued for a much broader view of executive privilege than what you just described. In fact, you wrote, and I quote, "The Nixon precedent has been consistently misinterpreted by scholars who fail to appreciate its limited scope." The studio went silent. Crockett had just read his own words back to him, words that directly contradicted the stance he had taken moments earlier. "That was written in a different context," he stammered, though his confidence had clearly faltered. "Was it?" Crockett pressed. "Because you were writing about executive privilege in relation to congressional subpoenas, the exact issue we're discussing now." The moderator leaned forward, sensing the shift in momentum. "Professor Dersowitz, would you like to clarify your position?" Before he could respond, Crockett pressed on. "Actually, since we're talking about qualifications, let me raise a point. In your critique of my testimony, you claimed I misunderstood separation of powers. But what you missed is that my testimony focused specifically on Congress's Article I powers. Those are powers I exercise daily as an elected member of the constitutional body you write about in theory." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. The audience was transfixed. Even the studio crew had stopped their usual mid-show work to watch. This was no longer just a debate. It was a systematic dismantling of an opponent's credibility using his own record against him. "The difference between us isn't just age or education, Professor," Crockett continued. "It's that you've spent decades teaching constitutional law, while I've spent the last 2 years practicing it as part of the body entrusted with those powers." Dersowitz's breathing was visibly heavier now. The professor who entered expecting an easy victory was shuffling his papers, struggling to regain control. "And let's address your recent media appearances," Crockett continued, her tone gaining strength. "Just last month, you argued on 3 different shows that Congress was overusing its oversight powers. But in your 1998 book, you devoted an entire chapter defending broad congressional investigative authority. Which position reflects your actual view, Professor?" The audience stirred. Crockett had flipped the narrative. She was no longer defending herself. She was exposing his contradictions. Reaching into her briefcase, she pulled out a thick folder labeled Dersowitz, Constitutional Contradictions, 2018-2024. "Since we're discussing expertise, I think the public deserves to know about your shifting interpretations," she said, opening the folder deliberately. "In 2018, regarding presidential immunity, you argued that sitting presidents should be broadly shielded from legal action. You wrote, and I quote, 'The presidency requires insulation from frivolous legal attacks that could paralyze executive functions.'" She looked up, her face calm but her meaning sharp. "But just 2 years earlier, in 2016, you took the opposite position about a different president, writing that executive accountability required active legal oversight and that no president should be above the law." Dersowitz squirmed in his seat. "Constitutional principles must be applied consistently, regardless of politics," he said weakly. "I agree," Crockett replied smoothly. "Which is why I'm asking, are your principles consistent, or do your interpretations shift based on who benefits politically?" She turned another page. "For example, in 2019, you argued impeachment required criminal conduct, dismissing abuse of power as insufficient grounds. Yet in 1998, you wrote that impeachment was designed precisely to address non-criminal abuses of authority." The moderator, clearly intrigued, asked, "Professor, how do you reconcile these conflicting positions?" By now, Dersowitz's face was red, beads of sweat visible despite the cool studio air. "Legal thinking evolves with new precedents," he muttered. "Does it evolve, Professor?" Crockett cut in, her voice like a scalpel. "Or does it follow your client list?" The studio fell silent. She had just made the suggestion outright that his scholarship shifted depending on who paid for it. That's outrageous, he sputtered, his composure gone. Is it outrageous or is it documented? Crockett asked evenly. Because I have 6 years of your public statements, media appearances, and legal briefs showing a pattern. Your interpretations consistently align with your professional interests. She closed the folder with finality, looking straight at him. Professor, you came here to question my qualifications, but the real issue is whether your constitutional scholarship has been compromised by advocacy. The American people deserve experts whose opinions aren't shaped by their paychecks. Dersowitz flushed deeper, his earlier confidence replaced by visible frustration. He had planned to embarrass a young congresswoman, but was instead being carefully dismantled by someone he had underestimated. Representative, I think you're confusing political work with legal expertise, he tried again. But Crockett wasn't finished. Professor, let's look at this so-called expertise. You've questioned my background tonight, but I'm curious. When you defended your controversial clients over the years, did you consider how that would affect your credibility as a constitutional scholar? The question landed precisely. Everyone knew who she meant, though she never said a name. She had forced him into an impossible choice: confront the issue directly or appear evasive. My representation of clients has nothing to do with my scholarship, he said tersely. Doesn't it? Crockett countered. Because your television arguments in recent years have often mirrored your clients' interests. At what point does advocacy stop being scholarship? The audience sat in silence. Crockett had just accused one of the nation's most prominent lawyers of allowing client relationships to distort his academic credibility, without ever saying it outright. Representative Crockett, that's a serious charge, he said, his voice rising for the first time. Is it a charge, Professor? She asked calmly. Or is it an observation based on your public record? I'm simply pointing out that your views appear to shift in step with your professional work. She opened another section of the folder. Take attorney-client privilege. Over the years, your interpretation has grown broader, right when you were representing clients who benefited from a broader privilege. That's not neutral scholarship, Professor. That's advocacy. Dersowitz's hands trembled slightly as he clutched his papers. Young lady, those are baseless accusations. The words hung in the air like a slap. The condescension was no longer subtle. It was blunt. Crockett's eyes sharpened, but her tone stayed measured. Professor, I am a United States representative and a licensed attorney. You can address me as Representative Crockett or Counselor Crockett. Young lady is not appropriate in a professional discussion between peers. The rebuke landed cleanly. She had just corrected one of America's most famous legal figures on live television for basic respect, while reinforcing her own authority. The moderator quickly interjected. You're absolutely right, Representative Crockett. Professor Dersowitz, would you care to answer her question about your constitutional positions? But the professor was clearly shaken. The confident professor who had entered the studio now appeared defensive and unprepared. His renowned debating skills seemed to desert him entirely. My legal positions have always been based on sound constitutional principles, he insisted, though his tone lacked conviction. Crockett immediately pressed the opening. Have they, Professor? Because I have here your 2017 television remarks, where you argued congressional subpoenas should be strictly limited, yet in your 2001 academic paper, you wrote that broad congressional investigative powers were essential to democratic oversight. She revealed another document from her growing stack of evidence. Which stance represents your true constitutional philosophy, Professor? The one that enhanced your academic standing, or the one that aligned with your client's needs? The question landed like an indictment. Dersowitz opened his mouth more than once, but no words followed. For perhaps the first time in his career, the celebrated debater was left silent by the weight of his own contradictions. The cameras caught every detail, his trembling hands shuffling papers, perspiration forming, at his brow the restless search for an answer to rescue his faltering case. "Professor?" the moderator prompted softly. But no lifeline came. Crockett watched with calm precision, as if she had anticipated this very moment. She knew his patterns, his reliance on intimidation when substance failed. Now, stripped of that shield and confronted with his record, he had nothing left. "I think," Crockett said evenly, her voice carrying through the silence, "what we're witnessing is what happens when reputation meets preparation, when assumptions encounter evidence, and when privilege faces accountability." She turned directly toward the camera. "The American people deserve more than legal experts whose views shift with their professional interests. They deserve scholars whose principles remain steady regardless of who pays them." Dersowitz finally found words, his voice faint. "Representative, I think we may simply view these legal issues differently." It was no answer, only surrender dressed as diplomacy. The exchange would soon be replayed millions of times online, remembered as the moment when old guard confidence collided with new generation preparation. Crockett leaned back, a slight smile crossing her face. She had been waiting, not just tonight, but for months. "Professor Dersowitz, since you emphasize expertise, let's discuss it." She opened a folder she had kept closed until now. "You've built a career on Harvard credentials and high-profile cases. But when was the last time you practiced law in a courtroom instead of commenting on television?" His face paled. "I've maintained my legal practice alongside my academic career." "Have you?" Crockett's tone stayed conversational, but the question hung sharp. "Because Massachusetts bar records show your last active case was over 3 years ago. Meanwhile, I was in federal court last month arguing a civil rights case." The studio fell silent. Even the crew leaned closer. "But let's focus on constitutional law," she continued. "You question my understanding of executive privilege. Have you reviewed the recent Court of Appeals ruling on congressional subpoenas to the prior administration?" "Of course," Dersowitz replied, though his voice lacked assurance. "Good." Crockett nodded. "Then you'll recall that the court explicitly cited the doctrine I referenced in my testimony, the same one you claimed showed my ignorance. In fact, the unanimous 3-judge panel, all appointed by Republican presidents, adopted that interpretation." She held up the document. "Which means either the Court of Appeals was wrong or—" She paused, letting the implication hang. "Your grasp of current constitutional law isn't as sharp as your reputation suggests." The audience remained still, witnessing a masterclass in debate. Dersowitz attempted to recover. "Representative, legal scholarship often advances positions courts later reject. That's part of the legal process." "You're right," Crockett agreed. "Scholarship does involve testing ideas. But tonight, you didn't frame your op-ed position as theory. You presented my accurate reading of the law as ignorance." Her voice grew stronger. "And that leads us to the real issue. This was never about constitutional law. It was about you assuming a young black woman from Texas couldn't possibly understand legal doctrine as well as a Harvard professor." The words landed with unmistakable force. "You came here planning to discredit me based on my background, my age, and my qualifications, but you didn't prepare." She raised another document. "You didn't know I graduated summa cum laude from law school. You didn't know I've argued constitutional cases in federal court. You didn't know I've published articles on congressional oversight. Most importantly, you didn't know I studied your work thoroughly, not to attack you, but to understand it. Because unlike some, I prepare for debates rather than assuming reputation will carry me." The moderator interjected, "Professor Dersowitz, would you like to respond?" But he remained silent, the man once known for demolishing opponents reduced to silence. Crockett delivered her final words with precision. "Professor, I respect your contributions to legal scholarship. Your work on civil liberties decades ago was significant. But respect for past achievements doesn't entitle you to dismiss my qualifications today." She closed her folder and addressed the camera. "The next generation doesn't need permission from the last to be competent. We just need the chance to prove it. And I think we just did." Dersowitz sat motionless, unable to reply, his silence as telling as any defeat. After a long pause, he finally muttered, I think Representative Crockett has made her point. It wasn't concession, it was surrender." As soon as the broadcast ended, the studio erupted. Producers scrambled, stunned by what they had witnessed. A young intern monitoring social media gasped at her phone as notifications poured in. "This is unreal," she whispered. "The clips are already going viral." Within minutes, hashtags trended worldwide. Crockett destroys Dersowitz rose to the top of Twitter. Instagram and TikTok overflowed with clips of his stunned silence. Her line, "We just need to prove it, and I think we just did," became an instant meme. But the true impact extended beyond social media. Across the country, families were discussing the moment. Young people texted their parents, "Did you see that?" Law students shared clips with professors. Political science classes would study the exchange for years. Media reaction was immediate. Networks struggled to find experts willing to defend Dersowitz. Analysts who had once praised him admitted that Crockett had outperformed him. "I've never seen anything like it," said a Georgetown law professor. "He came to lecture, but she had done the real homework." Conservative commentators were conflicted. Many had dismissed Crockett as inexperienced, but her careful dismantling of Dersowitz's arguments was undeniable. "Whatever you think of her politics," one conservative analyst admitted, "you can't question her preparation or her grasp of the law after tonight." Liberal commentators celebrated, though many focused less on the victory itself and more on what it revealed about generational change. "This debate wasn't just about one exchange," explained a political science professor. "It was about a generational shift, about long-standing assumptions being challenged, and about redefining who gets to be treated as an authority in American politics." The effect on Representative Crockett's career was swift and substantial. Within hours, her social media following had grown by hundreds of thousands. Invitations poured in from universities, legal associations, and major media outlets. Publishers quickly reached out with book proposals, while political fundraising, emails cited her debate as proof of fresh leadership, fueling a surge of donations to progressive campaigns nationwide. The impact on legal education was equally significant. Within weeks, law schools began weaving the exchange into their curriculum. Constitutional law professors assigned it not only for its legal analysis, but as a model of preparation and strategy. "My students see that knowing the law isn't enough," said a professor at a top law school. "You must know how to apply that knowledge when dealing with opponents who rely more on intimidation than substance." Mock trial teams studied her approach, her steady use of evidence, calm, delivery under pressure, and timing in revealing key points. Debate coaches incorporated her methods into high school and college programs. Academic researchers explored the psychological dynamics of the confrontation, analyzing how Dersowitz's assumptions about age, race, and gender had influenced his preparation and performance. Even business schools took notice. "Dersowitz made every mistake of an overconfident leader," noted a Harvard professor. "He underestimated his opponent, leaned too heavily on past achievements, and failed to prepare for someone who had done the work." Crockett's preparation soon became a case study in political communication programs, dissected for her disciplined research, thorough documentation, and patience under pressure. The ripple effects reached beyond politics. corporate boardrooms, law firms and universities began questioning their reliance on seniority and titles over current competence. The Crockett Effect changed how we handle client presentations, admitted a senior partner at a leading law firm. We realized reputation isn't enough. Up-to-date information and sharp arguments matter more. Medical schools reported similar changes, as younger doctors cited the debate as encouragement to challenge outdated practices. Engineering firms noted junior staff were more willing to question senior decisions when supported by recent research. Internationally, British barristers wrote about the exchange in professional journals, highlighting its lesson. Preparation outweighs reputation. European scholars used it in discussions on advocacy and scholarship. Most importantly, the debate emboldened a new generation. Applications to law schools rose sharply, especially among young women of color who cited Crockett as inspiration. Watching her showed me I didn't need permission to challenge authority, wrote one applicant. Preparation and knowledge can overcome any advantage. High schools and colleges also felt the impact. Debate teams studied Crockett's systematic research methods. Mock trial programs adopted her evidence-based approach. Political science students wrote term papers analyzing her strategy. Career counselors reported more interest in law and politics, especially among students who had once felt excluded. Young people saw someone who looked like them stand up to one of America's most intimidating legal figures and win, said a guidance counselor. The cultural response was just as strong. Late-night shows created skits. Podcasts dedicated entire episodes to the confrontation. Online, pulling a Crockett became shorthand for thorough preparation, defeating overconfidence. Publishers quickly released titles like The Preparation Revolution, When David Meets Goliath, Modern Political Combat, and The Crockett Method. Academic conferences hosted panels on the exchange. Political science journals published articles, examining its implications for democracy, generational change, and authority in politics. The debate became more than a single moment. It reshaped expectations. Crockett showed that preparation beats reputation, said a veteran political strategist. She proved that with research and composure, anyone can challenge the established order. For Dersowitz, the fallout was immediate. Legal blogs dissected his errors and contradictions. Colleagues privately admitted embarrassment. Speaking bureaus saw reduced demand for his appearances. The perception grew that his legendary debating skills had faltered when faced with a truly prepared opponent. His problem wasn't being wrong about everything, one analyst observed. It was assuming that being Alan Dersowitz was enough. It wasn't. The long-term consequences reached far beyond their careers. Law schools assigned the debate as mandatory viewing, not only for legal content, but as a masterclass in argument under pressure. Students learned that credentials matter, but staying current matters more, explained a Yale professor. Crockett's performance proved that up-to-date knowledge can outweigh decades of past accomplishments. The exchange also raised broader questions about American politics. Who gets taken seriously? Who must continually prove themselves while others are automatically seen as experts? How do bias and privilege shape debate? Crockett made visible what's usually hidden, noted a sociologist. She showed how debates are often tilted before they begin based on assumptions about who belongs at the table. Her words echoed far beyond the stage. The next generation of leaders doesn't need permission from the previous generation. To be competent appeared in graduation speeches, motivational posters, and campaign signs. Her breakdown of Dersowitz's arguments became a template for political preparation. 6 months later, asked about the debate during a congressional hearing, Crockett simply replied, "I believe in doing my homework." Dersowitz, meanwhile, faded from the spotlight. When pressed by reporters, he offered only, "Sometimes the student becomes the teacher." But by then, the lesson was clear. The story of Jasmine Crockett versus Alan Dersowitz became more than a viral debate. It became a blueprint. It showed that preparation, knowledge, and strategy can overcome privilege and reputation. It proved that in today's information age, being current matters more than being established. And it inspired a new generation of leaders not to wait for permission, but to be ready when their moment arrives. Make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more defining moments where the new generation challenges the old guard, proving again and again that preparation defeats reputation. The future of American politics is already here, and you won't want to miss what comes next.